bolts of voting. And I'm also excited, I'm going to build off of what Emily said, to have two great allies of our community here. Senator Julie Morrison as the state senator representing the fighting 29th district, representing portions of the north suburbs of Chicago in Lake and Cook counties, including Highland Park, Deerfield, and Lake Forest. She was recently the sponsor of SB or Senate Bill 1863, which was signed into law by Governor Pritzker this summer and supports our election in 2020 by expanding critical access to early voting and vote by mail. Grace Pye is the Director of Organizing at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago. And she transitioned into this role, while she's been at the organization for a while, she transitioned into this role in November of 2019. So I'm excited to have you both here. So why don't I just kick off with kind of an open-ended question. What's on the table for this year's election? And I'll ask Senator Morrison to start and then go over to Grace.
Well, Brian, thanks. It's really nice to be with everybody this morning. That is such an open-ended question, but such an easy answer. Like virtually everything is on the table. Everything from fair housing to marriage equality to criminal justice reform, things that we know need to happen, things that we are concerned about. It really is going to this election is going to have real ramifications. We even saw in the last year, as COVID hit our community so hard, when people lost jobs and information wasn't shared, tests weren't available, leadership from Washington on down makes a huge difference. This is an incredibly, incredibly important election. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm really glad to be here to kind of walk through, as Brian said, some of the nuts and bolts of what the election is going to look like in terms of operations and safety this year.
Senator, let me ask you one follow-up question, and then Grace, maybe you could chime in, which is, what would you say to someone who's like, look, I know the presidential election is important. I know the election for Senate is important. We all know how that's going to go in Illinois. I don't need to turn out to influence Illinois' vote for the U.S. Senate or for the U.S. president. What would you say to inspire people to vote and let them know what else is on the ballot that's important?
Well, first of all, being complacent is exactly what, and I don't mean to be too partisan here, but it's exactly what the Republicans want. They want us complacent. Don't go. The polls show we're winning. It's cold. I'm not really sure what to do with this ballot I got in the mail. Yeah, that's exactly what they do want. Please don't fall into that pit. I think we had some of that 4 years ago. I woke up the next morning devastated with the results. There are a lot of other things on your ballot. The fair tax is one of those. Please take time to thoughtfully understand what this question is. And please vote your whole ballot.
Great, Grace, what's on the table from your vantage point, and why would you inspire people in a blue state to vote? And let me ask also, if you are not part of the panelists right now, if you could make sure you're on mute. That way Emily can save you from her going in and muting you for you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Brian. I would echo everything that Senator Morrison said. Like, absolutely, the folks who are in power in the White House right now want us to feel like our votes don't make a difference and, like we should just stay home because it's not that big of a deal. But we know that the stakes are so, so high. And I think that local elections, our local races, our local ballot initiatives are critical to be able to kind of shield Illinois from whatever happens at the national level, right? And we've seen that, like the leadership of Governor Pritzker over the last few years has been really critical, both in the COVID response, and being able to protect community members, extend services to community members who are struggling, even more than the average person under COVID. And we have a really huge ballot initiative on our ballot this year in Illinois, the fair tax. And I've heard from some people in our community, like, oh, isn't this just Governor Pritzker's thing? You know, like, I didn't hear about the fair tax a few years ago. But the reality is that community organizations have been fighting for the fair tax for a decade, you know, and this has been a really important solution that we need to fight for to ensure that there is revenue to fund social services. You know, and just thinking about the Asian American community, so many of our community members, you know, are limited English proficient, encounter language access barriers, whether it's in voting or just going to the Social Security office, you know, to try to figure out what they need. And we need to make sure that there's enough funding to ensure that community organizations can do that outreach within each marginalized community across Illinois.
And Grace, one of the things we talk a lot about with our broader community is that those elected in the General Assembly this fall, in the Illinois House and Illinois Senate, will be the decision makers who draw the lines for all the congressional districts and all the state Senate and state House districts. From your vantage point, how important is that as a reason to drive people to the polls?
Yeah, I think it's a really important reason. You know, just like we were talking about the census this year, redistricting is one of those once every 10-year opportunities, right? If we don't make our voices heard in this election, then how can we make our voices heard when those maps are being redrawn? And, you know, we want to make sure that all of our different community voices are represented to ensure that, you know, minority communities and marginalized communities have gotten a full count in the census so that we can then, you know, leverage that in the redistricting process and make sure that there are fair districts that are drawn that truly represent our communities and allow our voices to be heard, you know, in our democracy. So I think that is really critical, you know, being involved in local elections now and then continuing that involvement after the election is over, you know, through next session, through the redistricting process. I think that's all really important.
So, Senator, we in your introduction, or my introduction of you, I mentioned SB 1863. Can you just tell us a little bit, like what inspired you to sponsor that absolutely critical piece of legislation, and what does it do that's different from previous years? Why is it so important right now?
So, unlike President Trump, if I could be so bold as to say that, some of us in Illinois realized early on, February, March, that this was going to be a devastating disease and that we anticipated it going all over the state and possibly and probably impacting our election. So this spring, I worked with various stakeholders who actually deal with the election cycle, with the county clerks, with League of Women Voters, with all kinds of different voting rights advocacy groups to talk about what can we do, how can we make adjustments so that everybody feels absolutely safe, regardless of where they live or what their health conditions are, to vote. And we went through many iterations of this. The bill that finally came out and that was passed and signed by the governor, first, I just want to say this is a bill that, think of it as Cinderella's coach. Midnight, December 31st, this coach goes back to a pumpkin. This legislation is for this election and this election only. It's specifically for COVID-19. So we're thinking of it as a pilot to see what works, what doesn't work, what needs tweaked. Did it make sense? So this is how the bill actually works. There are 108 election authorities across the state of Illinois who actually are going to take care of the administration of this election. There is a little bit of individual control over how that happens, but we have a lot of built-in security that should make people feel very comfortable. First of all, it started a few weeks ago when applications for your ballot were sent to you. If you voted or registered since March of 2018, you should have received an application for a ballot automatically. when you returned that, then you would get your actual ballot in the mail. Other things that we did that were a little more subtle was you're going to receive two, and you should have received them both by now, reminders from Jesse White, our Secretary of State. Hey, have you returned your application? If you didn't return your application, you get that second reminder. And in the constitutional amendment brochure that came out, that talks about that every household got, there was a reminder in there too, like, hey, you can vote by mail and here's how you can do it. We've pushed it as hard as we can as a state. We've encouraged all of our partners in the election world to also talk about it. And I think it's been pretty successful in that way. Let's see, after your application and after you get those two chasers, things that make this election safe and different. So election day is going to be a state holiday. Schools are closed. One of the things that we noticed during the primary, especially in Cook County, was we lost polling places the week of even, and really threw a wrench into things. We had election judges who said, oh, I'm really scared. I don't think I want to be there. I'm not comfortable with this. This bill closes all public schools for the day, allowing us to use those as polling sites, right? This bill also allows anyone 16 years old or older to be an election judge. We're trying to give our senior judges, who are amazing people, who are so committed, the opportunity to stay home and not feel that their health is going to be threatened. And what an amazing way to engage young people, to let 16 and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds come into the polling place, be trained as election judges, and get to like really participate. We're hoping that this also really engages a whole new group of people, young people. Grab them now when they're 16, 17, 18, and have them running for office by the time they're 21, 25. We need all those new young voices, and we need their participation. So I think that's one of the other really interesting good parts about this bill that we don't talk about a lot. So you get your envelope, you get your ballot, you fill it out. It's a couple envelopes. You know what? It's not that hard. You just you fold it, you put it in your envelope. You either mail it or you can deposit it at one of these collection boxes. And we can get into that if you want to know, but those are very, very safe places. Starting today, October 19th, early voting starts all over at polling places. So this is a day that you'll have access to those boxes at those places as well. I guess one of the things that's really important is that this bill creates a presumption of validity for your ballot. That means that when that ballot arrives in the clerk's office, whether you've dropped it in a box and it's collected every day and brought in, or whether you've mailed it, when it arrives at the clerk's office, it is presumed to be valid. Now, last year when we had elections, you would mail your ballot in, you would have an employee of the county clerk who would get your envelope, open it, say, yeah, that kind of looks like Julie Morrison's signature. Okay, yeah, good, we'll count that one. Or, I don't think so, I don't think. Now it's different. We've got election judges. The same people are going to show up on election day to process your ballot. These trained people who are sworn to be fair in a bipartisan pool of 3, so 2 Dems, a Republican, whatever, each one will look at each individual ballot that comes in to check for, to make sure your signature does match, to make sure that the envelope was sealed, to make sure that everything is correct. It takes all 3 of them to say, no, her ballots, that's not her signature. This is an extraordinary new level of safety, I think, for the voters. And let's say that no, Julie, you forgot to sign it. I mean, you didn't even sign it, or we don't think this is you. This law requires that you are going to be notified within 24 hours by that election authority, usually your county clerk, that there's something wrong with your ballot, and you're going to have the opportunity to what we call. So your ballot will count. We tried to put in as many things as we could, so that ballots wouldn't be rejected, and if they were, the people would have the opportunity to be corrected. Sorry to get long-winded about it.
No, there's a lot to it. And I think, this is a remarkable piece of legislation because of how robust it is in trying to make sure that as many people get the opportunity to vote safely and securely. Grace, I know you've been working to increase access to the ballot and to really eliminate discriminatory barriers to voting. Can you just tell us how that work is playing out during this cycle?
Yeah. So one of the issues that I mentioned earlier, language access, is something that we've worked on a lot in the context of voting and how to make voting more accessible for people for whom English is not their first language, right? Like you can speak enough English to get by in your day-to-day, but not have the like political or specific vocabulary to understand what a ballot initiative means, for example, right? Very relevant to our election this year. So one of the things that we've really advocated for over the years, but we're especially glad to be able to get in place for this year, is an expansion of the number of languages that translated ballots and voting information are available in. So the Voting Rights Act at the federal level requires Cook County to provide translations into 3 languages. Those are Spanish, Chinese, and Hindi, based on population size of the number of people in Illinois or in Cook County, that is, who speak those languages. But we wanted to be able to expand that number of languages because we know that there are so many people who are kind of in smaller communities by the numbers who still really need that access. So we collaborated with a couple of other organizations to pass the vote ordinance in Cook County last year, which expands the number of translated ballots and voting materials from those 3 languages that I mentioned to 11. And this November election is the first election where all 11 languages will be implemented and put in place. And so those languages are Korean, Tagalog, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Arabic, Gujarati, and Urdu. So you can see that there are a lot of Asian languages in that list because that's one of the unique things about the Asian American community. We have such a diversity of languages, even spoken within one particular country. So it's really important for us to do that type of outreach. And so luckily, with the implementation timeline being this year, that applies to vote by mail applications. So in Cook County, you can request a ballot, to vote by mail, and you can actually fill out that application in your language and then receive a translated ballot in that language. And that is part of the direction that we want to move in, to continue to expand that access. And then the other just piece that I want to highlight that we have also worked on, regarding ballot access is automatic voter registration. So we collaborated with a number of other organizations through the Just Democracy Coalition to pass automatic voter registration at the state level in 2017. But we've really encountered a lot of issues with the full implementation of that. So AVR essentially means, if you can, anytime you go to the DMV, you can update your registration if you've moved, or you can register to vote for the first time. But there are parts of the law that we passed that haven't been implemented by the Secretary of State yet. And, over the last year, there have been lots of issues. You might have seen in the news that the Secretary of State has kind of been in some hot water for mistakes that have been made. And so, we're really continuing to work. I mean, it was now 3 years ago that we passed the bill to make sure that that is fully implemented so that, all the people who are eligible to vote, but who have not registered in Illinois can get registered and just take one step, away from what stands between them and the ballot box.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder, there's going to be a few more questions that I have, but if you have a question for our speakers, please put them in the chat, and Emily will begin facilitating that in a few minutes. So a free-for-all question for both Senator and Grace. So let's say, the last day to vote, Mike Ziri always reminds me that we don't call it election day anymore. We call it the last day to vote. So the last day to vote is is 2 weeks from tomorrow. If you're not registered to vote yet, are you just, is this election no longer available for you?
Grace, do you want to handle that one?
Yeah, no, the answer is no. You absolutely can still register and vote. And please, please, please do that if you find yourself in that situation. And so one of the great things about Illinois is that we have same day registration. So you can actually register and vote on the last day of voting, as you said, commonly known as Election Day. But you can also go and register and vote at the same time at many early voting locations. So this will be dependent, on your county. But for example, in Chicago, this is called like grace period voting. You can show up to any of the 51 early voting sites in Chicago and register or update your registration. So if you've moved since you last voted, you're not sure, what address you're registered at, you can check that online. If you discover that it's your old address, you can look up the location, for your new address. You can go to any early voting site and say, hey, my voter registration is out of date. What you have to do is you have to show 2 forms of ID. So these are things like, a government issued ID, a school ID. You can bring a copy of your lease or your mortgage. You can bring a utility bill, to prove who you are and where you live. And then they'll be able to, get you registered at that new address, and you can vote same day. You have to register and vote at the same time. So you just have to make sure to budget enough time for that. But it's always good to know that you have that as a backup, just in case if you realize you panic, oh, I'm planning to vote today, but I don't know for sure. That's always available to you. And that's one of the great things about our voting infrastructure in Illinois.
Yeah.
It's accessible.
Great.
Or worst case, you go, it's election day. It is November 3rd. You show up and you're like, I'm here to vote. Whoa, you're you're not registered. I don't have all the documentation that you think I need. I have maybe one thing on me, right? You will still be able to vote a provisional ballot, and you will have 14 days. We talked about curing your ballot. You'll have 14 days to supply proof, those other documents, to show that you are a valid voter and where you live. So there's no excuses. Take the stuff with you, as Grace said. But if you forget and you don't have it, they still will give you a provisional ballot, which just means you're going to vote. It won't be counted until after election day. Because if you mail, same thing as if you mail your ballot. Say I don't mail it on November 3rd. Wasn't sure how I wanted to vote on something. Throw it in the mail. As long as it's postmarked by the 3rd, it is going to count. We're going to give 14 days for it to reach the county clerk for a final count. So don't think, it won't count. It's too late. It will count.
Great. Last question before we open it up. So, and Senator, you talked a little bit about this, but in the news, there's been a lot about voting security. There's been concerns about cutting of the post office budget. There have been, in other states, announcements of fake ballot drop boxes. Can you just share if somebody is really concerned about making sure their ballot is received and counted, what are the ways that they can do so, and what would give them confidence that their ballot will be safe and secure?
So I just did this myself. I got my ballot in the mail and I marked it and I mailed it off. Every county, well, I know Cook for sure, and Lake, and most of the collars, you can go online and you can actually track the progress of your ballot. You can look it up and it will tell you when it's been received by the county clerk. They're not going to be counted the day that they're received. There's not going to be this early number that's going to come out. But they're processed, which means they're opened, they're fed into the little machine, just as if you go to the polling place and vote, but the number won't be recorded or made public until election night. So you should feel absolutely comfortable that you can track it and gosh, I don't know. Does that help, Brian?
Grace, anything to add there?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, just for people who are worried about the security of their ballot, making sure it gets counted with all the noise in the national news about this, casting doubt on this. Anything to add about ways that people should feel confident about making sure their ballots received?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say again, kind of like Senator Morrison, speaking from my own personal experience, I am a Chicago voter. I've been really heartened by the ways that they've created these, email updates about your ballot. Like when I applied to vote by mail, I got an email saying, "We received your application." My understanding is that when I go to drop off my mail-in ballot at a drop box, like I will also get confirmation when they, timestamp collect my ballot to let me know that they received it. Our election infrastructure in Illinois, I think, is very strong. And so I think there is a lot of fear mongering happening at the national level that, is just that. It's just fear mongering. They want us to be afraid of our ballot. They want us to distrust, our institutions. And we, I think here especially, have reason to trust in our voting system, and just, do whatever makes you feel most confident. For me, that looks like I requested my vote by mail ballot. I have my ballot sitting on my dining table. I'm going to fill it out and I'm going to take it to physically drop off at an early voting location near me so I can put it in the drop box. That to me is what feels, most comfortable. For some people, it might look like standing in line at a early voting site and voting in person, so that you can have that feeling. But the most important thing is, just to vote.
I love that you say that, Grace, because my husband and I a couple of weeks ago actually sat down and made our voting plans. And I was a vote by mail guy. So I got my ballot, I sent it in, I got my email, which I loved. I actually took a picture of it, put it on social media. It says Cook County's received your ballot. But Toby, he wanted to go vote in person. So he voted this weekend in our ward at the early voting site. So I know everybody's got a different approach to this, but for us, it was super important to make sure that we both sat down and talked about our voting plan, and that way we could support each other and hold each other accountable to that.
But Brian, what if you change your mind? You've got your ballot. What if you're like, I really want to go. I've changed my mind. I want to go vote in person. All you do is you take your ballot with you. Okay. And a lot of people are going to do this. You take your ballot with you and you surrender it to the judge when you walk in and say, "I've changed my mind." Okay. What if you lose your ballot or it gets shredded accidentally or the dog eats it or whatever? You can still go in and vote in person. You'll have to sign an affidavit that says the dog ate it, or I lost it, or I never even really got it. This is wrong. You're going to
My
sign
toddler spilled milk all over it, which is what would happen in our house.
Yeah. Okay. So something bad happened. You're going to sign an affidavit. You're going to be issued a new ballot, right? So no excuses.
Love that.
Yep.
All right. We've got a couple questions coming in. I can see. Emily, let me turn it over to you to facilitate the Q&A from the attendees.
Sounds good. So we have two questions from Karla Baley-Smith. I want to start with the first one, which I think connects back to some of the security questions you all were discussing. But Karla is in McLean County, and the election commission there, which is referred to as the Bloomington Election Commission, as well as the county clerk, oversees that county's elections, I believe. So she's wondering, if there's not a processing or tracking ballot system like what we have in Cook County, how should it work if there are challenges to mail-in ballots under those commissions and that county clerk? Do we have any other process to address those? I don't know if it.
I think I'm just a clarification question. I'm not entirely sure what challenges Karla is referring to. Like, are we talking about if you're worried that your ballot wasn't received, or if you haven't, gotten your ballot in the mail that you requested?
I'm going to unmute Karla. Karla, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Right. So I voted by mail and dropped off my application. Our county clerk has a way you can look it up online and see that your ballot has been received. The Bloomington Election Commission does not. I called them this morning and they said, oh, well, we haven't started processing the ballots yet. So then I hear you talking about the fact that we're allowed to know if our ballots have been challenged. But if the Bloomington Election Commission is not, like, they don't seem to be following the rules that have been laid out.
So that election commission, as I said, you know, there is some independence that we're allowing individual county clerks, election organizations that are doing this. Do they have to have tracking online available? I don't believe that is in the statute. Do they have to allow you the ability to cure you? Do they have to notify you? Absolutely. They might not have to say, hey, we got your ballot, but they do have to let you know if they're not going to count it for some reason. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Senator. I'm going to stick with Karla because she had one other question. So let's talk about that. Karla, do you want to ask your question yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I have some volunteers who are making phone calls, and I have designated a handful of older women who are in retirement centers who just want to use paper lists, and and I said, hey, why don't you call people who don't normally vote? Maybe they voted in a presidential a couple of times, but they don't participate always. What language, you know, as I write the script for these women to make these phone calls to typical non-voters, what language works well to encourage people to participate?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this one because we do very similar work of talking to that particular population. Lots of Asian American voters fall into that category of people who don't often vote. Maybe they vote every once in a while, maybe they've never voted, but they're certainly not in the category of always voting in every election, right? And you know, the method that we use is what's known as deep canvassing. And there has been a recent study that showed that this type of conversation with a voter is much more effective in motivating them to take some sort of action, you know, whether it's registering to vote or voting, making a plan to vote. And what it does is you're asking the voter, what are issues that motivate them? What are things that they care about? What are things that they want to see changed in their communities? What are worries or concerns that they have? You know, and these days, especially this year, we all have those anxieties and concerns. We're all worried about something, whether it's our health, whether it's our loved ones, whether it's about our jobs, or whether we'll have economic security. And so the purpose of that beginning of the conversation is really to ask them those questions. Most of us are not asked that, you know, we're not given a chance to share those types of things, especially with someone who's calling about an election. And so when you start the conversation there, then you can connect things that they care about. Say it's healthcare access. You can connect that to why it's important to vote. The voter will both remember that conversation. They're much more likely to remember it, and they're much more likely to take action on the thing that you're asking them to do because they know why it matters for them personally. It's not just some generic, you know, poll tested line about, oh, like it's your civic duty, you know, like that doesn't resonate because everybody knows, like, okay, that's just your talking, you know, that's your talking point. So it's really about personalizing the conversation.
Good idea. Thanks, Grace. Anything to add, Senator, on that point?
No, that was, I love that personalizing, and I think you're right.
Excellent. I'm going to move to questions from our good friend Emma Vasicki. She is being prolific in the chat section, so I'm going to start with her first two, and then we'll skip to somebody else, and if we can get back to her, we will. So Emma asks two things. One, have you seen a significant increase in younger polling judges, Senator, since your bill has encouraged that?
In Cook County especially, and I don't know statewide, I really don't have a read on, you know, downstate, but I know especially in Cook County, there has been more. So that's really good news.
Excellent. And then another question from Emma is, when do these different election commissions, bodies, when do they actually begin to count votes from the mail-in and drop-off ballot boxes?
Yeah, so those ballots that are, collected at the drop box, like through election day, through the time when polls close, and mail-in ballots that have been received by 7 p.m. on election day will be counted on election day. And so it's the ballots that are received after that point. If you mail it out, it's postmarked on election day, it takes maybe 5 days to get to the election authority. Those will be counted as they come in, but everything that's been received up until that point will be counted on election night.
Excellent.
And those boxes are emptied every night,
Okay.
or at least once every 24 hours. So, yeah.
Excellent. We have a great question from Freddie Roberts. Freddie asks, what are we doing to make sure that Black and brown people are at the election boxes or the ballot box, especially when we think about Black and brown, trans, and queer people?
Yeah.
I can start with that. Oh, Grace, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
We've launched at Equality Illinois, we have launched a campaign called Vote Naked, which encourages people to vote from the safety and security of their own homes. And we have been working with a host of Black and brown influencers, particularly on the south and west side of Chicago, to spread the word in Chicago. We've also done a huge, in addition to that, a digital and social media push targeting Black, brown, and trans queer people with a focus on the city of Chicago to just encourage them to vote. That's what we're doing that's what the C3 at Equality Illinois has been doing. Grace, I don't know if you want to talk more.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there are these broader structural efforts, right, policy-wise, to make voting more accessible. And, we know that like these, when we see voter suppression tactics around the country, it's about limiting access. And so when we're expanding access, all of those advocacy efforts are specifically for our most marginalized communities, whether it's Black or brown communities or limited English communities, right? Like we see these kind of intersections of the identities, right? And what makes it hardest for you to access, your right to vote. And maybe it's that, you struggle to find affordable housing. And so you're constantly moving, right? You're maybe in a community that is more transient. Like we can see all of these different struggles in the context of our voting process. And so when we make it easier to register, easier to vote, when we expand the options for voting, right? Like Brian said, encouraging people to vote by mail, making sure that people have access to whatever option feels most comfortable to them. I think all of those have, these kind of intersectional layers to them.
Yeah, that's why the date of registration is so important. And also there are some states that are still so backward that they require a photo ID. And I'll tell you, I've had a couple calls in my office saying, you better require a photo ID. You don't know who these people are. Those people are our neighbors, okay? And state of Illinois, as long as I'm around, will never require a photo ID. We want to make sure everybody has complete comfort and their rights are being exercised to go in and vote.
Absolutely. Thank you. A great question from WBEZ. Can both of you sum up what the biggest voter safety concern you have is for this election?
I think my biggest voter safety concern is the fear that is being almost institutionalized from various parties and various people, trying to make people afraid and intimidated to go vote. To me, that is the greatest fear. The Department of Public Health has put out very good guidelines for all these 108 election authorities. How do you set up your polling places? What is safe? We have put funding and made funding available for those election authorities, new money that came from the federal government that's going to be distributed across the state for PPE, for cleaning, for all those things that we know are extra and important. So it's not so much a case of fear. I don't have fear of people actually being infected, though I think we have to be really, really careful. My concern is that people will stay away because of some of this really negative fear mongering that's going on.
I have similar concerns as Senator Morrison on the fear piece. You know, I think when thinking about like health and safety and voting in a time of COVID, I am a little bit concerned that, you know, we'll see like crowded polling places on election day. I'm really encouraged by the high numbers of vote by mail applications that we've seen, you know, and the just like broad awareness of voting by mail this year as an option, and early voting, you know, to decrease those lines on election day. So I'm really hopeful, you know, but I've already heard stories of people waiting in line for hours at early voting sites. And so, you know, I just want to make sure that like everybody who is voting in person has a mask, is maintaining social distance, that, you know, those cleaning, you know, protocols that Senator Morrison described, like are in place at these various polling sites, because, you know, just with the recent news about the spike in COVID cases in Chicago and in Cook County, I think we can't be too careful on that.
So
Excellent.
I need to give you guys like one little negative piece of information, and it should encourage you to vote by mail, actually. The mask thing is incredibly important. I would say most people are wearing them and are going to do that. If you have a voter who walks into a polling place and refuses to put a mask on, they cannot be turned away. It is a fundamental right for that person to be allowed in the polling place to vote. Now, judges are going to be instructed to divert them over to a corner or to a place away from others. But just so you know, they do have the legal right to be in a polling place without a mask. That's just one more reason to do vote by mail.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that clarification, Senator. Eric Brown is asking, what are the efforts underway to support, you touched on this a little bit, Senator, folks who are housing insecure to get registered, and how are reaching those populations and make sure that they're able to vote?
Well, I'm sure Grace has got actual programs going on, but a lot of advocacy groups do have formal get out the vote and registration programs. But I would say being able to show up at a polling place, even just with a piece of mail, and then having the ability to come back and provide the additional documentation for your ballot to count, that's important. You will not be denied. The other thing is we have a lot of voter protection this year. We have attorneys and even some law students who are going to be posted at every polling place, hopefully, that are, if there is someone who feels their right is being denied, that there will be a judge, there will be an attorney there to provide immediate contact with the State Board of Elections to assure that your rights are being upheld. So if you unfortunately would be in that situation, look for that person, and they're going to be staffed all day on election day like that.
Great. Grace, anything?
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, I mean, I think it's important for like advocacy organizations, especially, to target our outreach to those communities that are harder to reach, because the reality is that like many partisan political campaigns just don't have the resources or capacity to do that. You know, partisan campaigns are usually focusing on the people who always vote, because they want to make sure that, you know, they're convincing the people who they can count on to vote for them, right? And so it does fall on more advocacy organizations to expand that universe of people that we're talking to and say, like, we're specifically going to reach out to all newly registered voters, like people who registered for the first time in 2020 or in 2019. or we're going to target voters between the ages of, who are younger than say 24, who might be voting in their first election. Or thinking about those different demographics. So right now, Advancing Justice and our sister C4, Asian American Midwest Progressives, we are exclusively calling Asian American voters. And we're calling like as many of them as possible, even the ones who don't typically vote, because we know that that community is not really reached out to proactively by anyone else. And that when I say, oh, I'm calling with an Asian American organization, that might make a difference for that voter, right? To be like, oh, like I've never been called about anything political. Like, how interesting. I actually like heard this funny tidbit from an organization that did a poll of Asian American voters in swing states. It was a commissioned poll, and they said never in their history of doing polls had they ever heard someone say, thank you so much for calling me and asking these questions. I would love to give my opinion as a voter. But that when they called Asian Americans, they were like, we're curious about your opinions as an Asian American voter. The people they called were like, wow, thanks so much for calling. Yeah. And so I think, that type of outreach really makes a difference.
Great. We are going to do one more question from the chat, and then I have just an open-ended one for the two of you. So we're going to have to do some problem solving for Anthony, who's asked our final question. He made a mistake with his mail-in ballot. He's been notified that he should request a new ballot, and he's wondering, is there enough time for him to request a new ballot to vote by mail, or do you recommend that he goes to an early voting site? What's the best approach in this situation?
Has he already sent his ballot? Can he get on live?
Yeah, I'm gonna find him right now. Let's see. We've got quite a few folks here today. So let's see. Anthony, if you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and do that, but I'm trying to find you to ask your question.
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Go ahead.
Yep.
Hi,
Yeah. So,
what happened?
there's like an oval where I just like cover the yes and the no. And so it's kind of like,
Okay.
well, I can't get the white out and white it out. So
Right.
like,
So do you still have your ballot?
yeah, I do.
Okay, walk it in. You can walk it in and vote over.
I mean, it's only for one of the judges. So it's not like the other parts are wrong. It's just that one little thing that's wrong. And I thought, well, I just don't want it to not count in its entirety for one little mistake is my biggest concern.
Well, they would count, every other race would be counted. Okay. So everything else, but you want your selection for the judges. I mean, that's an important vote too, whether you're retaining or not, or whatever it is. The best way, honestly, is if you're comfortable, is to go in to a polling place and surrender your ballot, and they will hand you a new one. And you basically just start over. That's the easiest way. I mean, you still do have time to, that's a really interesting question. I haven't talked to anybody that actually wanted to do a mail again. Yeah. Do that. You'll be safe that way. It will get counted.
So are you saying they would give me a new ballot and I can mail it in later? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, they'll probably ask you to vote it on the spot.
I can do that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Anthony.
Yep.
Okay, so before we wrap things up, I just wanted to give both of you an opportunity to leave our audience with whatever else you want them to know about this election. That could be, whether there are other ways they can get involved to get out the vote, other specific dates or election related like must-dos that you think people should have in their heads for these last 2 weeks. I just wanted to open the floor up to make sure that folks hear the messages that are most important to you. So whoever has that top of mind, you can jump in when you're ready.
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off. I have 3 quick things. The first is, of course, make a plan to vote. Pull out your calendar, pencil in your time. I'm going to fill out my ballot at this time. If you have it at home to mail in, I'm going to drop it off at the drop box at this time. For me, I will be taking some time tonight after dinner to complete my ballot. I've been compiling all of my research up until now. And then, sometime this week, I'm going to drive over to the 5th Ward early voting location and I'll drop it off so that I, have that certainty that it was received. The second thing is vote yes on the fair tax. This is a critical, local issue for us as Illinoisans to ensure that we have progressive revenue, that, when we are facing something like the COVID-19 pandemic and we're facing potential cuts to all these social services that will affect our most marginalized communities, whether it's, limited English proficient folks, whether it's immigrants and refugees, whether it's trans folks, whether it's folks who are housing insecure, our Black and Brown communities, we need to ensure that we're able to provide that revenue to fund those services that reach those communities, and that we're raising it from the people who can most afford it. And then last but not least, get involved in the election, attend a phone bank to get out the vote in a community that you care about, or, write postcards or whatever it is, text your family and friends, make sure that they have a plan to vote. When Advancing Justice did voter outreach in the 2018 general election, overall turnout in the AAPI community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, was 44%. That's 10% lower than overall statewide turnout, which was 54%. But among the people that we called, among the Asian Americans that we called and asked them make a plan to vote, we were able to increase turnout in that group to 55%. We were able to bring that community up to that, overall statewide rate, actually just a little bit higher. So my point is, those calls make a difference. They may feel really hard, they may feel frustrating or draining at times, but it really does make a difference. So please, find a way to be involved in this election.
Thank you, Grace. Before I turn it over to you, Senator, can I ask you one question, Grace, about the fair tax? Can you explain the difference between leaving it blank and just voting yes? I've seen a lot of literature about this, and I just want to make people understand the implications of leaving that blank.
Yes. So there are two thresholds for what allows a ballot initiative to pass. And in order to pass the fair tax, we really need people to fill out the question. Don't leave it blank, because leaving it blank will just make it harder for us to enact this change. And so it's really important to let people in your networks know, your family and friends know, hey, this is the first question on your ballot, please vote on it. Honestly, even if you disagree, although we should all do everything in our power to get folks to agree, vote on it. Don't skip it, because it needs to reach this. There are two different thresholds. They're a little bit complicated, but we really need people to vote on the question.
Thank you. Senator, back to you for your closing thoughts on things you want people to know.
The phone banking's such a good idea, but oh my gosh, that's kind of hard to do. I will tell you, it's not my favorite job, but if you're not totally comfortable with that, make sure that you talk to your neighbors, your friends, a sister, a brother. Just kind of get out your Christmas card list or whatever, and maybe just send an email like, hey, I voted today. I sure hope you did. It doesn't have to be to a random stranger that you don't know that may not listen to you on the phone, but do your part to reach out to somebody. If you just make sure 5 people voted, that's huge. That's really what we need. And also think about running yourself. A lot of times we don't even consider ourselves to be candidates. You know what? Sometimes you're not going to be asked specifically. You need to step up and say, I can do that. I have enough common sense. I care about my community. I'm willing to serve. Please consider running or work really hard for somebody that is taking that step forward. Find a candidate that you care about. Find a candidate that shares your values and your belief system and get behind them, because the decisions that are made, especially in the General Assembly next year, are going to reverberate for years and years even for our kids. So make sure that you participate somehow and use your voice. And I hope you'll consider running. Everybody's just a regular person until they win the election, and then they get some title, really. Okay, so do it.
I love that, Senator. Thank you so much. Brian, any closing thoughts from you before we wrap it up?
No, I would just say vote, make a plan to vote. Tell talk to your loved ones so they hold you accountable. Do the same. If everybody gets one more person to vote, then our democracy is even more reflective of our community.
Great. Well, Senator Julie Morrison, Grace Pye, thank you so much for being here with us today. It was extremely helpful. Thanks to everybody else who joined us. I just want to note, if you are a member of the Emerging Leaders Circle, please hop on over to the other Zoom link that you received from me this morning, and Mike and I will see you there in a few minutes.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having me this
everyone.
morning. Bye. Have a good day.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.